Welcome to Vermont Artists and Authors, where we interview great storytellers and artists from the amazing Green Mountain State. This is episode 34. I'm your host, Barney Smith of StoryComic.com, and we're excited to have with us the highly renowned and award-winning Vermont author, Stephen Harris. Steve.
Hey, it's great to be here. I really appreciate it, and a chance to chat with you. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Oh, I'm excited about it. Before we went live, we were talking about some of your other books that you published that had some World War I historical biographies. But I mean, we're also here to talk about your latest book, No Excuses. And so I'm excited to get into it and jump in and talk about this. And I know that you are an award-winning author. You've done a lot of historical biographies. For the sake of our audience, whether they be listening to this as a podcast or watching this online, can you give people a little bit of background how you got into writing?
Well, I come from a family of newspaper people and writers.
Right.
My grandfather was the foreign editor of the old New York Herald. Started his newspaper career on the Kansas City Star with Ernest Hemingway, who was, the 18-year-old lad. And my grandfather he was already married, but he was a few years older. And his brother, my great uncle, was one of the first reporters on the New York Daily News. And my other great uncle, who was the brother of my grandmother, he was a cartoonist and a magazine illustrator. He also started out on the Kansas City Star. He came to New York and he became an extraordinary magazine illustrator, doing over 350 stories for the Saturday Evening Post, Collier's. Wow. And then Al Capp, who created Little Abner, said to him, magazine illustration is going to go the way of the dodo bird because photography is coming in. He said, right. I've got an idea for a comic strip. Let's do a comic strip. So my uncle said, okay. So they created a comic strip called Abby and Slats. Great uncle Rayburn Van Buren, he wrote it or drew it, and Al Capp wrote the continuity. And that lasted until the late 80s. And then he retired. And my mother was a freelance writer, and my sister was one of the first women to work for Sports Illustrated. When it first came back in the mid-50s, I happened to have the actual first Sports Illustrated issue. When I was a little kid, I thought that was kind of neat. And so it was just in my blood. We'd sit around the dining room table. We'd talk about writers and writing. And, I started my newspaper career in a hometown newspaper, and then I worked for a daily in Vermont. And then I got drafted and went to the Army in the 70s and 60s and got out. And then I got a job working for General Electric as the editor of their corporate magazine. That was a great job.
Well, yeah, because you did mention, so you worked for the Burlington Free Press for a bit, correct?
Yes, I did. I was in their Capitol Bureau in Montpelier, covering state capitol and seeing what was going on, what kind of shenanigans were happening with the legislators. And that was kind of interesting. And I did that. And then I went back down from Connecticut. Then I went back down to Connecticut and I'd worked for my old newspaper again as an editor. It was a weekly newspaper in Reading, and I did that. And then I came back to Vermont and worked at PR for Champlain College. And then I went back down to Connecticut, where I was the editor of the General Electric corporate magazine Monogram. And then I came back to Vermont, where I started writing my books.
Well, so I'm very curious before we jump in and talk about the difference between, let's say, journalism and biography and then fiction. As someone who's been basically touching different genres of journalism over the span of about 40 years or so, how has journalism evolved over the years?
Well, I think it's gotten worse. Reporters, you went after the truth,
right?
And if you found something, you wanted to prove something, you had to make sure you had the facts were all there. Today, I don't trust any news person because they've got an agenda, and whether you're a conservative or a liberal, they all have agendas now, and it gets to the point, I think, I could be wrong, that what are they trying to tell you? Are they telling you the truth? Are they trying to find the truth? I don't know. But even back in the old days, back in yellow journalism, it was like that today. Everybody was making up stories and doing things, and the sensationalism was the thing. And I just feel like the old days, back in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, it was great. But I think maybe the Vietnam War started to change journalism because the country was so divided by those who didn't want to go and those who went, those who, if they stayed in college or taught, they wouldn't get drafted. And all of a sudden, I think that you could start to see a change, a slant of journalism, a little more not telling lies, but trying to force you to believe something if they could find a way to do it, and whether it be pro-war or anti-war.
Right. And it's almost too, like, also with the advent of the 24-hour news cycle, it becomes more, like you said, sensationalism, trying to get the viewership and the readership is.
And the thing is, if you watch television, whatever channel you watch, which is 24 hours of news, whether it's Fox, CNN, or MSNBC, it's the same story. For you start in the morning and they repeat it constantly, and at the end of the day, your head is aching. I can't watch this anymore. So I watch Jeopardy.
Talking about it too, like the level of, say, the attention of the readership. How have you seen that from when you were working, say, from the 80s to the 90s as well?
That's a good question. What's happening, I think, is, the print journalism is kind of, I think it's going to go away. And it's all going to be, the cell phone, and you're doing that kind of stuff, the ebooks, and you get that. And I'm an old timer. I like the feel of a book. I like the feel of a magazine. I haven't made the crossover yet but I do have the cell phone, I will admit. I watch these people, they get so engrossed, and I'm looking at it, they're not reading anything, they're playing games. I still think people are still intently reading stuff, whether it's print or ebook or whatever it is. I don't think that's changed. At least I hope it hasn't.
Right. And now, do you see, so how was the evolution that after you became a journalist and then you started writing, before we went on the air, we talked about a few of your books that you started doing some research back in the late 90s on some history of World War I, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. And how was the writing process different for writing an actual book as compared to doing some journalism?
That's a good question, but I don't think it's really that different.
Okay.
Because you've got to find the truth. One of the things that when I was doing my research on my World War I books, one of the things I learned in my family was human interest. Everybody loves human interest. What's going on with this person? Who is this person? How does that person affect this person? And so I knew that to make my books work, the World War I books, I had to find the human interest. I knew the battles and I knew the history of the regiments, but I wanted to know biographies of the soldiers themselves. And so the main thing was to find the families, because all these soldiers, when I started researching, of course, had been dead for a long time. So my wife and I started going through obituaries, doing all sorts, going to historical societies in the towns where these soldiers came from, tracking them down. And lo and behold, I was surprised at how many families had letters, had memories, had stories that were passed down. And that was how I was able to develop a different thing than regular journalism, where you usually find the person you're writing about or the situation that you're writing about, and it's right there in front of you. But when you start to do the history and you start to track down the families, it becomes a totally different way of gathering the information.
And I know before we went live, we were talking about the lack of general knowledge, historically general knowledge of World War I as compared to, say, World War II. I'd be curious as well, was there a lot of push to have that historical knowledge of as it was called, the Great War, right after the Great War and before World War II started. There was a span of about 15 plus years in between those.
There was. There were a lot of good books that came out of that at that time. And one of them, of course, was All Quiet on the Western Front, which is considered, one of the great war books ever. It's a novel ever written, and it was written by a soldier who had participated in the war. And there was a lot of so much interest in the war, and then all of a sudden people just got tired of hearing about the war, and it just kind of dropped off. And then all of a sudden, bingo, we're in World War II, and then the same thing happened. But the interest in World War II has lasted and is still strong all these years later.
Right. And do you believe part of it could be the fact there was such a definitive quote unquote villain that people can kind of point to for World War II that might have been lacking in World War I?
That's another good question. Yes, I mean, Hitler was the villain, and Germany, had just invaded Poland, and what was happening in the Holocaust, and people would just. That was a true villain. That was a monster.
Right.
World War I, you did have Germany as a villain, of course, because the Americans, the Allies, and the big villain there was the Kaiser. And there's a lot of political cartoons of the Kaiser that make the film pretty funny. And one of them has Teddy Roosevelt, pounding his head in and stuff like that in the newspapers. But he wasn't a monster villain. He was just the villain. And one of the things that started the war was the U-boats, the sinking of merchant ships, passenger ships, and then, of course, the sinking of the Lusitania that killed over 1,000 people, including almost 200 Americans. And that almost started the war. And then a little time passed, and then another thing happened, and then the war started.
So how did journalism prepare you to research to make these historical biographies?
Well, there were two things. Number one, when you're a journalist, you learn how to do investigations and how to ask the right questions and know the right places to go. And that was the foundation. And so it was just a stepping stone to start doing the research, for these books. So I did have that investigative training and experience that I learned in all the years that I was a journalist.
And you did, as we did mention earlier, you put out about 4 books about World War I, correct?
I did. You have it posted there. That was my first book. And what happened was, my great uncle, Rayburn Van Buren, he was in the 7th Regiment. I happened to have his bayonet and I happened to have his helmet. But I never talked too much about him, about the war. I was always talking to him about his cartooning and his magazine illustration career in New York. And when he died, I was up in my mother's attic, and I found this box, and it was filled with letters that he had written from the Western Front to his mother, my great grandmother. And I started reading the letters. I couldn't put him down. He was a great writer. He had cartoons. He scribbled cartoons on the letters that he wrote home. And as I read them, I said, "This is a book." And I didn't know anything about World War I, so I had to research World War I. I had to go down to the National Archives in Maryland to get all the research and put it all together. And then I started tracking down a lot of the families of the soldiers who were in the regiment to get their stories. And all of a sudden I had a story, and I wrote the book, and it just worked out that well. And as I told you earlier, there was an experience at Camp Wadsworth in South Carolina when the 7th Regiment, which was made up of all the rich guys from the Upper East Side of New York, were down training with the New York Division. And while they were down there, the War Department sent the regiment from Harlem, all these black soldiers down south in 1917, which was, I thought, a bonehead decision by the War Department. Why would you send black soldiers down from New York down to South Carolina? And there's going to be a race riot. And there almost was, and they sent the Harlem Hellfighters, before they were named the Hellfighters, to back to France without training, to be out of harm's way, oddly enough. And as they were leaving Camp Wadsworth, they had to march through a gauntlet of white soldiers made up of their brethren, white brethren from New York City, the 7th Regiment. And as they marched through with their rifles on their shoulders, the 7th Regiment, the soldiers sang to them George M. Cohan's stirring song, Over There. And I said, I got to write a story about the Hellfighters. And I did.
Wow. And you didn't stop there.
No, I didn't stop there. When I said, okay, I've done, the white guy, the rich white guys, the hardworking black guys, and now I'm going to do the Irish. So I went and I did the book on Father Francis Duffy, whose statue graces Times Square to this day, probably the most beloved and famous priest in American history. And I started doing that, and I researched and I wrote a Duffy's War. And it's interesting, talk about research. I had read on my research that a guy by the name of Richard O'Neill, he was from Harlem, a professional boxer, and he won the Congressional Medal of Honor, and he for the Fighting Irish, and he kept a war diary. And boy, did I want that war diary! And I said, I got to find that war diary, and I got his obituary. And in obituaries, they always say who the survivors are. And then they say where their survivors lived. And then I contact the survivors if I can. But there was no survivors listed. So I went on Ancestry.com. And I said, I'm writing a book on the Fighting 69th. And I want to know about Sergeant Richard O'Neill, who had a war diary and won the Congressional Medal of Honor. Well, I posted it. I'm doing all this research. A year goes by. And all of a sudden, I get an email from Dublin, Ireland. And the guy said, I just wrote a book on the O'Neills, and I got a nasty phone call from a guy in Michigan. He said, you never put my father in there, and he won the Congressional Medal of Honor fighting for the Fighting 69th. And boy, I got all excited. And so I called him up, and I said, well, who I was? I said, is this Richard O'Neill's son? He said, yeah, I'm William Donovan O'Neill. Well, William O'Donovan is the guy that founded the CIA, and he was in the 69th. And I said, oh, he's the right guy. And I said, do you have your father's war diary? He said, I do. I'll send it to you. And he sent me the diary. Never had it insured, just sent it to me.
Oh, wow.
And I had the war diary. Of course, I sent it back to him. And then I chatted with him, and he gave me all sorts of information about his father, about Father Duffy. And that was kind of neat. It's just interesting how those things fall into place.
And then you wrote your 4th book, The Rock of the Marne.
Yeah, that was the 3rd Division. The 3rd Division, they're called the Rock of the Marne because they were on the Marne River, and the Germans were going to do their last final assault. And if they could go over the Marne River, they might win the war. So they took the strongest point was the Rock of the Marne with the 3rd Division, and they stopped the Germans from crossing the river, and they earned that title, the Rock of the Marne. And in World War II, one of the soldiers of the 3rd Division was probably the most decorated soldier in American history, Audie Murphy. And he went on to become a movie actor, but Audie Murphy was a soldier in the Rock of the Marne. And so I did that. And then I didn't know what else to do. So what else do I want to write? And all of a sudden, I decided I'd write a book inspired by my son, Mark, who was a great decathlete in high school and college. And he's a native Vermonter. And so I sat down and wrote a novel, and a young adult novel. Fiction is totally different than nonfiction, of course. And I sat there and I wrote it, but I had a lot of inspiration beside my son. One of my heroes when I was growing up was Bob Mathias.
Yeah.
I don't know if a lot of people know who Bob Mathias is today, but
He won the decathlon in 1948, 1952.
that's correct. He was the youngest. He still is to this day the youngest Olympic gold medalist in track and field. And I had a chance to interview him and meet him personally when I was writing my first book, 100 Golden Olympians. And so I had to interview all these 100 Golden Olympians. So I interviewed him. And one of the other ones that I interviewed was Bill Toomey, who won the gold medal in 1968. And Bill Toomey and I became good friends. And he would tell me stories about, good decathletes come from small towns. They come from the country because in high school, there's not a lot of students, a lot of athletes. So they got to play track, they got to do football, you got to play basketball, baseball, do all these things. So they're very good at all these events. I said, oh, that makes sense. And so I started thinking about this young boy up in the wilds of the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont, living in the mountains, running around, jumping boulders and doing all this stuff. And then all of a sudden he comes down and he's got all this natural ability to do these events, but he never did them. He doesn't know anything about track and field. But then he meets another guy, a wounded Vietnam veteran, who is trying to get his life back together and comes to Vermont and stays at his house, living in the barn. And he teaches the hero, his name is Skeets, how to hurdle, how to pole vault. He's a natural because that's what he did, and jumping over rocks and everything up in the mountains. And so then he does this, and he goes down to New York City to the Eastern High School States Track Championship, which really exists at Randall's Island in Manhattan. And my son competed there. I saw Dan O'Brien compete there. And so I put that the setting is where they do their decathlon and what happens. Whether he wins it or not, it's another story.
Right. Yeah. And then you mentioned too, like the term "no excuses."
Okay, the term "no excuses." Another person that I interviewed in my book on 100 Golden Olympians was Glenn Davis. And Glenn Davis in 1956, 1960 won 3 gold medals. He was the world record holder in the intermediate or the 400 meter hurdles. And he won both gold medals, setting world records. And he was also anchored the 4x400 relay, winning his 3rd gold medal. But Glenn Davis was the son of a coal miner in West Virginia. And when he was 16 years old, his father was dying of lung cancer and still smoking cigarettes. And he went to the hospital to see him just before he died, and with him was his mother. And they sat by the bed until Glenn Davis's father died. And then there was a lot of sadness, of course, and they got in the car. Glenn was driving, and his mother dropped dead of a heart attack in his lap. They were driving, and he was so angry. He was an orphan. He just would go and beat people up. He wouldn't do anything. He wouldn't go to school. And but before that happened, he was on the high school football team, and he was so good that Woody Hayes, who was the coach at Ohio State, came down to see him. And he was only a sophomore in high school. He said, "I can't talk to you. I'll see you in 2 years." And then Davis's parents died, and he went to Barberton, Ohio, just south of Akron. And there he started to take up track and football, and he played basketball. He did everything. He won the state track championship for his team just by himself. And Woody Hayes came down and said, "I want you to come to Ohio State and play football." And he was still an angry young man, still angry. But he had a motto, and that motto was "no excuses." And he's not going to let any excuse get in the way of doing what he wants to do. And he went to Ohio State to play football. And Woody Hayes saw how fast he was. And he said, "No, I'm going to turn you over to the track coach who coached Jesse Owens, who won the 4 gold medals in 1936. And then from there, Glenn Davis went on to become, the fastest human. He even played football for the Detroit Lions. He was playing catch in Ohio State Stadium, and Howard Hopalong Cassidy, who won the Heisman Trophy, playing for the Lions, said, "Come on out and try out for the Lions." He did. He made it. But he only played a couple years, and then he quit. But that no excuses, that motto that he had carried him through, got him past all the hard times, and that's why I use that as the title for the book, because the two protagonists in the book have to overcome certain things, and they decide. And the Vietnam veteran, he's a wounded Vietnam veteran. He's the fellow in the wheelchair. He knew Glenn Davis. This is all fiction, but in my book, he knows Glenn Davis, and Glenn Davis comes to the hospital where our hero is back from getting shot down. He was a helicopter pilot, and tells him about no excuses. You can't have excuses. You're going to get over this. And he carries a poster that Glenn Davis hurdling, and it says "No excuses" on the top. And so he uses that, and he tells Skeets, you can be a decathlete. He's a shy boy. He doesn't think he can fit in with the other kids at school. And he says, you can. There are no excuses. And that's the theme that follows through the book.
Right. Now, so talk to us a bit about, you mentioned earlier that writing fiction is different than writing biography. What were some of the opportunities and challenges that you faced writing a fiction book?
Well, the one thing about writing fiction is your characters have to be believable. You can't say that guy he doesn't ring true. They've got to ring true. And so when you're writing it, make sure the characterizations, the things that this person will do are not off the wall, something that wouldn't make any sense if you follow his character. His character's got to be true all the way through. I mean, it can change, but and a lot of books change. This is the no excuses. That's what happened to Skeets. He changes. Right. But to say that part of him is always true. That one thing that string that follows him is always true. And that's what. And the other thing is, if you're going to write about an animal, make sure that what you write about that animal is true. You can't have a five-legged possum out there, running laps. You got to make sure it's sleeping on the road. But but you got to have those kind of things, and you got to make sure that in Vermont you have the Green Mountains. Okay, they're not that tall, but they're magnificent. But you can't put the Rockies. Can't say they're 15,000 feet high. You can't do that. You got to have everything's got to be true, but everything else can be made up. The plot line, of course, is all made up.
Did you find it easier to write no excuses as compared to your World War I biographies?
It's never easy to write. It's the one thing that was probably easier is I didn't have to do a lot of research. Right. But I guess over time, I had been researching no excuses because I'd always been interested in the decathlon. And eventually I wanted to write a book on the history of the Olympic decathlon. And I started researching the decathlon, and that's how I became friends with Bill Toomey. And he and I became friends. And actually we grew up in the same, in Fairfield County, Connecticut. He grew up in New Canaan. I grew up in Norwalk, two towns that abutted each other. He's a couple of years older than I am, but we never knew each other. But now we do. And I was just talking to him about the decathlon and how he would say that good decathletes come from small towns. Look at Bruce Jenner, Caitlyn Jenner. Bruce Jenner came from Newtown, Connecticut, his Sandy Hook, actually. That's a very small town. And Bob Mathias came from San Joaquin Valley in a small town, Tulare. That's a small town. So a lot of these guys came from small towns. And very few of them come from, big cities, because in a big city, you go to a big high school, you're only going to play one sport probably because there's too many other people playing sports. That's his theory. I bought it. My son came from, he grew up in Westport, which is a suburban town of just outside New York City, but it's a small town. And he played track, and he pole vaulted, he played basketball. He did the decathlon in high school. And then he went to George Mason to be on a track athlete. He was down there for 2 years and he dropped out, and he was building houses, which is what he really loves to do. And one day, a guy named Rob Musio came by and said, I want to make the U.S. Olympic team. Will you train with me? And Rob Musio had been the 2-time NCAA Division I decathlon champion at George Mason. And so my son trained with him. And at Randall's Island in New York, they had a chance to make the U.S. team that was going to go to the World Games in, I think it was Japan. And Dan O'Brien was there. Dave Johnson was there. Both guys were going to go on to win medals. And there was a whole bunch of other guys that were, obviously were competing. Rob Musio made the team. That inspired my son. And then Rob Musio made the U.S. Olympic team and finished 6th, which was great. And my son came back home and he said, Dad, I'm going back to school. I want to make the U.S. Olympic decathlon team. And college, he won the New England Intercollegiate Decathlon Championship at Dartmouth. And then he got injured. And that ended his career. But he now coaches. I mean, he's building. He loves to build stuff. So he's in construction. But he coaches. He comes in Middlebury, where he lives. He coaches at the Middlebury College and at the high school. He teaches the kids how to do pole vault. And that was his record. He was, a 3-time New England pole vault high school champion.
Right. It seems as though, like, your book, No Excuses, seems to have combined 3 of your favorite things almost. One is the decathlon, one being the Olympic piece, one is having a Vietnam vet in there, and you've wrote about war stories, and you put it under the backdrop of Vermont, which, as you mentioned earlier, has a lot of family history with you, with yourself and your son. Now, were you deliberate in adding these 3 ingredients into a book, or was this something that happened as you were writing?
I don't know if I thought of it that way. I just I wanted the kid, to do the thing, but how am I going to get him to learn these events, being shy and not going out for any of the teams in high school? And then all of a sudden I said, I'm going to bring in a Vietnam veteran, but he's got to be wounded. So he's got to have a reason why he's there. So I put him there, and I developed his story. So I developed both stories, and I have a few other people, their stories developed, including a girl. You got to have a girl. You got to have that romance, that kind of there. So I brought her in, and that worked out. And it took me a while to develop her because I come from a family of 4 sisters. So I 2 grandmothers and my mother. They all lived in the same house at the same time, and I was like the lonesome guy. I think I did a pretty good job with her, trying to develop her character, from a guy's point of view.
Right.
That may have been the hardest thing.
Right. And I think you said in a previous interview too, is that the main characters almost seem to be like an amalgamation of Bob Mathias, your son Mark, and also Glenn Davis. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yes. They're all 3 of them. I could see, Glenn Davis, a guy that had to overcome so much sadness in his life that made him so angry. And in that way, he was a handicapped guy. And then, of course, Bob Mathias, being so young and trying to, when he competed in 1948, he competed against World War II veterans. And they were mad. They wanted to win because they couldn't compete in 1940. They couldn't compete in 1944.
Right.
So 48 was their chance, and they really wanted to compete and win. And here comes this little bratty kid from California, 17 years old, and he blows them out. It was just so great to interview Bob Mathias, to hear his story and how he won in 52. And he could have won in 56, except back in the day, you couldn't make money off of your fame as an Olympian. And he started in his movie, the Bob Mathias story, in 1954, I think it was. That took care of it. He could have won 3 in a row. He didn't. And that movie was what made me, when I was a little kid, when I saw, I was a teenager, when I saw that movie, that made me he was my hero.
Now, talk to us a bit about your process. Now, when you first wrote your first World War I book, that was back in the early 2000s. So you have about 20 years, almost 20 years of experience, and you've written 5 books so far. How is your process different from your first book to this book?
It hasn't changed at all. I think you have to get into a rhythm. And that means you've got to get up, you do little things that you do, but you got these habits that you do. I have to do 3 crossword puzzles in the morning. So I do 3 crossword puzzles. Then I read just a little bit to get my brain going. And then I sit down and I write. And I try to write, 100 to 300 to 400 words a day, depending on how the day is going. And then I will think about it. And even sometimes I can't sleep at night because I'm thinking about what I wrote. I'm thinking about what I'm going to write, how am I going to write it. And then I come down and then I rewrite. I sit there and I rewrite. I'm just a terrible rewriter, or a good rewriter. I don't know, but I rewrite a lot. And then I get it. And it has to be on a clean sheet of paper. I can't have any colors. Thank goodness for the computer, because I can do it and print it out and I have my page. And then if I make I'm terrible. I'd probably kill 1,000 trees, but that's what I do, and I get it going. And then eventually at the end of the year, I've got 300 pages, 350 pages. It's done.
Wow.
And it's amazing. And when I was writing Duffy's War, I had an next door neighbor, and after work, he was a lawyer. And after work, he'd come over to the house for a glass of wine. He was a good Irish bachelor, and he would come over for a glass of wine. He'd walk into the house at 6 or 7 o'clock at night, and the first thing he'd say to me, "Did you amount to anything today?" And I'd have to say, "Yeah, I wrote 200 words. Is that good?" And that's the way it was. And that's how it is. I have to write. If I don't write, if I miss a day, I don't write on Sundays, but if I miss a day, it's like, oh my goodness, what am I going to do? I got to make that up, but I got to keep writing. And that's when I start writing. Before that, then I have to do the research too. If I'm doing like the nonfiction book, sometimes it'll take a year and a half to do the research. And then I spend all the time I'm doing the research. I'm, like the plot, the way I'm going to write it is pounding inside my skull.
So, Steve, how important is an editor for an author when it comes to that?
Exceedingly important. I've had 2 good editors. I'll mention one of them, Don McKeon. That he was my editor for my first 3 books. And he was at Potomac Books, and he would write little things. He was a wise guy. He would make little snide remarks in the column sometimes and get me mad. And I call him up and say, "I'm just kidding, but you got to understand why I made that change, because you think you've got it all,
right? But
you don't." And an editor is, he's there to make sure everything comes out. He's like, you're a dirty pair of pants on the ironing board. He's the iron, and he does that. So that's that. You've got to have a good editor. And my book on Rock of the Marne, I had a good editor at Penguin Random House, and she was terrific. And then she vanished. Nobody knows where she went. And I always wanted to thank her and whatever it was, but she was gone. But she was a good editor. In my No Excuses, I had a good editor at Rootstock Publishing. I was very fortunate to have a good editor there as well. When I wrote 100 Golden Olympians for the U.S. Olympic Committee, I was not only the writer, I was my own editor. And, but my wife is a terrific proofreader. She's great. She reads everything, and she doesn't write snide remarks on the column. She whacks me on the side of the head. What do you mean to say that? Not, but she was good.
And so so you did mention that you rewrite a lot of things.
Yeah.
How that process where you start off being your own editor, do you see that as doing the work of an editor and you're able to, self-delete certain parts of it? Or do you feel as though that actually hinders the work of an editor because you might have taken some things out that an editor might have suggested leaving in?
Well, the editor will not see I only send them the finished product.
Right.
So they don't see all my changes that I edit through. I will read one page over maybe 3 or 4 times and keep making changes until I feel like I've got it where I want. And if I write a chapter or I write an article or a short story, I always give it to my wife, and she reads it, and she says, "Did you mean to say that? And you got this? You're missing a word there," something like that. She always makes sure that everything is good before it's sent out. She does that.
It came out through Rootstock Publishing.
Right.
How did you find Rootstock Publishing to do your publishing for?
Well, it's interesting because the first publisher was for 100 Golden Olympians was the U.S. Olympic Committee, and that was a one-time deal. And then when I started I didn't have an agent. When I started writing my war books, my first 3, I went through a Writer's Digest looking for a publisher, and I came across it was called Brassey's, and they were like one of the top military publishers in the world. So I sent them a query and a couple of chapters, and they accepted it, and they paid me an upfront fee of $2,000. And then they did my next book and my third book, and then they got sold to University of Nebraska Press. And I decided I'm going to try something else, so I got an agent. And my agent and I sent him about the Rock of the Marne, because when I was in the Army, I remember I would go into the sergeant's office, and they always had a poster, Rock of the Marne. And I always went, what the heck is a Rock of the Marne? And so I decided to check out the Rock of the Marne. I found out. So my agent got Berkeley Caliber, which is an imprint of Penguin Random House. They were my publisher. And I told you the editor was good. She disappeared. So they did no publicity for the book at all. Nothing. So I was a little mad. I did all this work, and they never got me any going to Walmart or going to Barnes and Noble and talk. The other publisher did that. So I said, I'm going to self-publish. Right. I thought about self-publishing, and I said, no, I don't want to do that. So my wife's reading, and she always reads the Middlebury Addison Independent, because this is where we lived, and she loved it. She said, look at this guy just won an award for young adult novel from Rootstock Publishing in Montpelier, Vermont. I said, oh. So, because my book was, out in Vermont, so I contacted them, and what they are is they're called a hybrid publisher. It's a cross between traditional publishing and independent publishing, self-publishing. And you give the money up front, and they do all the work. And it's great, but you're right there all the way. And they'll tell you this, we're going to do this. They send you the edits. Is this okay? Does this work? But they make sure everything's good. They have a great proofreader, a copy editor, a regular editor, and now they have a terrific marketing gal who's doing all the marketing. I'm very, very impressed with them.
And I tell you, so Steve, if people want to learn more about your books, they can go to, you have a website, StephenLHarris.com. Would that be the best place that people could go to?
That's correct. That's it. And if they want to leave a message, I will answer the message. Yeah. Okay.
And as we talked about, you do have, and all of your books, all the books that we were just talking about are available to look at right up here as well. All 4 of your World War I books, and plus No Excuses is right there at the top, and the one that just came out a couple months ago.
Right. That's right. And there's a few other things. There's some articles that I've written that are that are on my website, as well as a movie treatment that I did, well, many years ago, but I couldn't find any interest in it. But right now, I think it might be good. It's called The Rainbow Kid. It's about,
Rainbow Kid, right here. Yep.
yeah, it's about a superhero who is Mexican American, and he's being smuggled across the border.
Wow.
This was a long time ago, and he gets in trouble with the traffickers, human traffickers, and they throw him out in the middle of the desert because he saw a rainbow, and they said, "Yeah, go find that rainbow, kid." And so he's out in the desert all by himself, and he crawls to the rainbow, and he finds the end of the rainbow, and he goes down inside the rainbow, and he becomes a superhero. The rainbow.
That's nice.
But he rides
Motocross
bikes. That's his. He doesn't ride horses or fly, but he has a motorbike, and he shoots all over the desert.
That's cool. And then you're also, and as you mentioned too, that No Excuses can be found also at the rootstockpublishing.com as well.
Yeah,
so
it's on Amazon. It's Barnes and Noble. It should be in a lot for those in Vermont. It should be in a lot of Vermont bookstores.
Right. Perfect. All right. Well, listen, so thanks a lot for coming on, Stephen. As you mentioned, you do a lot of writing. So the next time you have a book, come back on. I'd love to chat with you more. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate it so much, Barney. Wow.